So for those that are staying, just going to take a little right turn and look at a nutrition focus. So I just want to welcome Nessan Costello and Sierra Chantlet to the stage. So while they're coming up, Nessan's going to be first on. Nessan is a PhD student at Leeds Beckett, an academy nutritionist at Leeds Rhinos, and nutritionist at Leeds United, talking about the energy demands of rugby players. So Mike is here.
Cheers. No one left. Next slide.
It's not voice activated, not yet, mate, not yet, not yet.
Cheers. The energetic demands of rugby, collisions and considerations. So firstly, thanks to Ben and Kev for putting on a fantastic conference and inviting us to speak. My name is Nessan Costello. I'm a performance nutritionist, part-time at Leeds Rhinos Academy and Scholarship, doing my PhD here at Leeds Beckett University. And today I'm going to be talking about the energetic demands of professional adolescent rugby league players. That's what my PhD is focused on. But I truly believe that this information is relevant to anyone that plays rugby. So the energy expenditures and the literature is quite consistent for me. We'll talk through that. So if you're a coach, an athlete, an S&C coach working with a rugby player at a school, a rugby league player at a school, all the way through to a senior athlete at professional standard, this information is of relevance to you. And ultimately underpins health development and performance of your athletes. So if you're worried about body composition, if they're overfueling, if you're worried about your athlete not putting on size or mass or meeting energy demands, then they're potentially underfueling. If you're worried about your athletes coming to training, be able to work as hard as they need to be to get the training stimulus, which this whole conference has been about, maximizing training adaptations, it all comes back to, are they eating enough? Are they overeating? Can we maximize that training response? Are we maximizing recovery from that training stimulus? And ultimately then performance from there. So agenda, what we're going to quickly go through, so measuring total energy expenditure, the hows and why. What does current research tell us? Collisions, the impact expenditure and then consequences of that. And at the end, I really want to give a practical outlook of considerations for you guys. So ultimately, I don't want it to be an interesting 50-minute talk and then you don't change anything that you're doing. You need to be thinking about energy balance. Are you assessing what your athletes are eating? Are they eating enough? Are they not eating enough? And I truly believe, hopefully, I'll convince you to do that by the end of this talk. So total energy expenditure, you want to know what your athletes are expending, and that's made up of a number of different components. So you've got basal metabolic rate plus arousal equals resting metabolic rate. And that's the amount of energy they need to stay alive at rest. And that makes up the largest component of someone's total energy expenditure because most people aren't very physically active. Now for athletes, it doesn't because they're quite active. The thermic effect of food, which is the amount of energy you need to digest the food that you eat. For a rugby player, they have a high protein diet, so that's going to be quite large. Adaptive thermogenesis, which we're not going to focus on too much today. And then you come down to physical activity level. So how active is your athlete across the season, which we're all really interested in. If you divide someone's total energy expenditure by the resting metabolic rate, you get a PAL, or physical activity level. And that means we can compare how active different animals or different people are across different sports. So again, really interesting. We'll talk through that literature today. So how are we going to assess total energy expenditure? It basically comes down to heat. How much heat is someone producing? Direct and indirect calorimetry, which is just a Latin and Greek word put together. Cala, heat, metron, measure. Direct is the heat that someone produces or it dissipates, and you have to put them in a metabolic chamber. Obviously, that's quite difficult. Would be very difficult to play a rugby game in a confined space, very expensive, so obvious limitations. The second one is indirect calorimetry, and that's the measure of how much oxygen someone's consuming. So we know the energy cost per litre of oxygen that someone consumes. If you measure CO2 production as well, you can work out which fuels they're burning. So are they burning carbohydrate? Are they burning fat? And then from that, you can get an energy expenditure. So the picture that you can see behind me is actually some of the Leeds Rhinos professional under-19 players that we got in the season, pre-season, to assess how much energy they're burning at rest. So that's indirect calorimetry. Now, obviously, as you can understand, that'd be very hard to wear during a rugby game, or nearly impossible. So what's the next best thing? And we come to doubly labelled water. So a lot of research groups are currently using this. The main limitation is it's extremely expensive, about £1,000 per participant, so we've been extremely fortunate to use that here at Leeds. And they consume essentially water with two different radioisotopes in it. One is deuterium, which you can see behind me is the 2H. That measures how much water someone's expending, so how much that leaves the body as water. and then the 18 oxygen leaves the body as water and carbon dioxide. So essentially it's indirect calorimetry again, and from that we can work out total energy expenditure. Now this method is considered valid and reliable. It's not perfect, there is some variation, but it's really, really important to consider that if you want an accurate measure of energy expenditure in a free living environment, this is as good as it's going to get. Now obviously you guys are practitioners, you don't have £1,000 to assess how much your athletes are spending, so what are you going to go to? And what we typically would have done, we'd go to a prediction equation. So you want to work out how much energy someone's using at rest. You use those 4 resting metabolic rate equations beneath me, or you can use a physical activity level above. Unfortunately, me and Debbie pulled our data together, and we've shown that both methods are invalid and unreliable. So if you're using the resting metabolic rate equations, they'll typically underestimate by anything from 50 to 500 calories. So that's quite significant already if you're trying to plan a diet for someone. It's already that far out, and it had a large typical error as well of about 700 calories. And then for the PAL physical activity levels, it overestimated energy expenditures. Now this is really interesting. I want you to think about why that might be the case, and we'll hopefully have the answers by the end of the presentation. Other things you can look at, wearable technology. Everyone has a Fitbit, heart rate monitors, etc., different ways of measuring expenditure. What the literature has used in the past is metabolic power, so Martin Boucher, etc., Chelsea Oxendale have done great work validating or invalidating that. And what we wanted to see is if you actually wore a SenseWear armband and took the GPS metric of what someone was doing during training, how far would it come out? Unfortunately, it was invalid and unreliable. 1,000 calories out per day compared to double-label water for professional rugby players in season. So really, my end take-home confusion, if you want to assess what people are spending or rugby players are spending, you've got to test, don't guess. And it's really, really important then from planning diet. So why is this important? As I stated before, it comes down to underpin of everything that we do. If you're not eating enough, then your athlete's going to have poor development. The athlete's going to have poor development, health and performance. So why is this important? Again, going through the metabolic demands of the game, adolescent rugby players can do anything from 30 to 50 tackles during a match. Dan Weaving's done some fantastic work in this space, showing that you can do up to 18 collisions in a peak 10-minute period. That's a collision every 113 meters. These collisions are large, so up to 10 gravitational force, which is similar to NFL. Notorious for large collisions. Ultimately, they define the sport. In pre-season periods, our adolescent athletes can cover anything up to 20 kilometers. That's similar to professional players. Obviously, training 5 days a week. These are professional demands, and these guys are young guys. They're going through the second stage of growth in the lifespan, second only to infancy. They have huge home-based loads. So Charlotte Hinchcliffe has done some fantastic work of her PhD, and she's shown that adolescent rugby players have up to 86 individual demands placed upon them, from developing peer relationships, so it might be friendships, or it might be a love-based relationship, anything to physiological demands. So we had SenseWear armbands on the player across pre-season periods. On top of all the training they were doing, they were taking up to 100,000 steps per day on average, a week on average, sorry. That's a huge demand that you're not really accounting for, and it all adds up to their total energy expenditure. Now, on top of that, we're asking them to go through a huge stage of development, which takes a lot of energy. Some of these guys need to put on 30 kg in 2 to 3 seasons if they want to play senior professional rugby. They need a huge amount of energy, so it's really, really important we understand these demands. And as James Moran coined nicely, they really are in a league of their own. The inflammation markers of the game of rugby league are severe, and we'll talk about the energetic consequences of that. And it really comes down to, are you fueling your athlete adequately for training, adequately for training adaptation, for training recovery, for match recovery, and ultimately for health. So what does the literature tell us? So again, all of this research comes from double-label water, so we consider it as valid. Firstly, James Moran looked at energy expenditures of senior professional rugby league players in season, expending on average 5,500 calories per day. A Tour de France cyclist will go through 6,000 calories per day during a Tour de France, which is considered by most as like one of the most grueling events in sport. These guys are doing it during a typical week. So big take-home messages from this first study in 2016. One, they have very large energy expenditures, much larger than we would have ever predicted. They had low resting metabolic rates, and that's in red because I'm going to mention that later, and it's an interesting one. You would expect it to be high. Was there positional differences? They did investigate that. Small population size, hard to know. Keeps flashing on and off. And there was a 35.3% increase between week 1 and week 2. And I want to know, why did that increase occur? As you can see, 14 banana difference between week 1 and week 2. What caused that difference? If you're looking at professional football players using W labeled water, energy expenditure was much lower. So 3,500 calories per day on average in season. This was a 2-game week. Even though they run a similar amount per game, why were those energy expenditures so much lower? Despite running potentially up to 10 kilometers more per week, similar amount of accelerations, decelerations, what's causing that? Now, this is coming on to Debbie's research, which has recently been published. Much larger population, which is fantastic. Again, using W labeled water. She looked at the differences between codes. So was there a difference in energy expenditure between rugby union and rugby league? She showed that there wasn't. There was an unclear difference. Looks like there wasn't a difference, but there was large individual variation. Again, it confirms the huge energy expenditures of professional rugby players. 44 bananas a day just to maintain weight. Obviously, you probably start thinking, where's that energy going to come from? Do they have the support to achieve that? How do we know if they're eating enough? And if you look at it across age groups, so Debbie again looked at the difference between under 16-year-old players, under 19-year-old players, and under 24-year-olds. As you can see, there was actually unclear differences, but it looks like there was an age-related difference in energy expenditure per age group. Now, what is causing that difference? We know as players get older, they get bigger. They put on muscle mass, they put on size. So it's likely down to the body weight of the athlete. And this was shown really nicely when you look at individual data in Debbie's data set. So she showed one 14-year-old player at 60 kg expended on average 3,000 calories, whereas a 24-year-old player at 120 kg was up at 7,600. To give you an indication, that's one of the nearest highest energy expenditures you'll see across sport. Nordic skiers are around 9,000. The highest energy expenditures we could expect to physically see might be around 12,000 per day. So it gives you an indication just how much food that person would need to eat. And you might be thinking, how are my props still fat if they need to eat that much food? It's a good question, I'm not sure. That's 15 Big Macs. Some people might think they could eat that. So yeah, what does all this literature tell us before we delve in some of the stuff that we've done that is currently unpublished? So 1, they have distinct energetic demands. 2, these appear to exceed running demands. So where's that energy coming from? And likely related to body mass and body position, although we don't have evidence for that at the moment. So again, where's this energy coming from? And if we look at the game of rugby, it's clear to see that collisions define our sport. They're large, they're maximal, and they're frequent. So do collisions increase total energy expenditure? I've got a short video to play now.
Using a randomised crossover design, 6 professional adolescent rugby league players completed 2 5-day pre-season training microcycles, containing either a contact or non-contact training session. The contact training session incorporated 20 competitive one-on-one collisions made up of 10 tackles and 10 hit-ups. The non-contact training session involved no collisions and was matched for movement demands. All other training sessions were matched and did not involve collisions. Total energy expenditure was measured using W labeled water, the literature gold standard. The contact training session resulted in a very likely higher total energy expenditure of 1,185 calories across the 5-day training microcycle. Collisions substantially increased total energy expenditure. This has immediate implications for collision-based athletes and may explain their high energy expenditures, which appear to exceed kinematic demands. Therefore, we suggest fueling for the muscle damage caused alongside the kinematic work required to meet the increased energetic demands of professional collision-based athletes.
There we go. Right, I really want to emphasize this point. First study ever to show across any sport that collisions increase total energy expenditure. We worked extremely hard to try and control extraneous variables, so it was a randomized crossover design. Unfortunately, it wasn't counterbalanced because 2 participants got injured outside of the collision intervention, frustratingly. But yeah, we used gold standard assessment techniques. We assessed the resting metabolic rate in the lab via indirect calorimetry, and we used W labeled water. The tackles, so the intervention was 10 tackles and 10 hit-ups. It was bone on bone, it was maximal. We had a coach directing the session. It was competitive as well. They were trying to beat each other to score a try. It was obviously peer influenced as well. They were all watching each other and they don't want to miss a tackle in front of someone else. And what we showed was that those 10 collisions, or 20 collisions, sorry, 10 tackles and 10 hit-ups significantly increased total energy expenditure by 1,200 calories. Now, if you think of how many collision sessions you would expect in a typical rugby season, you would probably do a collision session on a Tuesday and then a match on a Saturday or a Sunday, or in pre-season you might do collision sessions on a Saturday and a Tuesday and a Saturday. Your energy expenditure is going to be increased for the next 5 days. We actually think this is quite modest. Before I go on to that though, I just want to quickly highlight that even though we only had 6 participants, this was significant. So as you can see, everyone's energy expenditure increased. Really interesting, you can see that the higher energy expenditures, so that one way up on top, that guy was 110 kg. As you come down, the second highest energy expenditures was 100 kg, and then these lower energy expenditures were around 80 kg. So it falls back into that idea that the bigger the player, the larger the energy expenditures, probably the bigger the collisions as well, and the more mass they just have to carry. So what does this mean? And essentially I think it's really, really exciting because it begins to explain all of the descriptive research that's currently published. So one, the distinct energy expenditures that we've shown with gold standard techniques and other research groups have shown is probably most likely down to collision-induced muscle damage from training, from match play, and from large body masses. Two, that 35.3% increase from week 1 to week 2 in James Moran's study actually I believe shows the collision-induced damage from match play. So what James did, they had a 2-week assessment period with a game on the Sunday of both weeks. Now, that energy expenditure was significantly higher in the second week period, most likely because they caused a lot of muscle damage in that first week. They had a training taper into the first week, which is why that resting metabolic rate was so low. And they had a huge increase in energy expenditure across the second week. To give you an indication, it was 1,500 calories per day higher. That's 10,000 calorie increase. It gives you an indication of the match-based demands of professional rugby players. How are you going to fuel your athlete to recover from that? Especially if they have to train again in 2 days. What support are you giving them? Distinct resting metabolic rate. So we have published data showing that an 80 kg player expended 3,500 calories at rest just to maintain weight. That player subsequently always struggled to maintain weight. He can never put on size. He was only 80 kg. And that was shown across 2-week periods. So that was in a pre-season as well. Actually, sorry, I want to mention as well, could the DOMS be related to that high energy expenditure? One of my beliefs, so this is just hypothetical, no research to back this up, but we obviously know that with damaging training, you get a repeat bout effect, as you would expect muscle damage to decrease, and as a consequence, you'd probably expect total energy or calorific cost to decrease as well. So does that lead into the effects? And then finally, all of those underestimations, prediction equations, the wearable technology, it doesn't account for collisions. Maybe that's why it's underestimating. So does muscle damage cause the collisions? Well, we showed that players were sore after the training session. Tom just did a good example of explaining that that's probably related to muscle damage. Really interesting as well that we know impacts cause subclinical brain damage. We know that the brain tissue has protein synthesis rates about 3 times higher than lean tissue. So it's likely that muscle damage in the brain could be causing these high energy expenditures as well, or at least contributing. Again, really, really exciting data that we haven't published, looking at resting metabolic rate of a professional player before and after game. So before a game, after that game, there was a 600 calorie increase in his amount of energy he would need at rest just to maintain weight. We believe that's due to muscle damage from sustained during the game. What I think is really interesting as well is that he hadn't recovered 3 days later. 300 calorie decrease, but it's still higher than it was during the season. So what does that mean across the season? What does that mean for a young player potentially playing a lot? And essentially the take-home message is we want you guys to fuel your athletes for the amount of damage we think that the exercise is going to cause. If you're doing a collision session, you know they're going to cause muscle damage or brain damage to some extent. You're going to need to account for that. You can't just eat enough for the training session. So quickly, because I'm running out of time, pre vs in-season demands, we use the same players. So this is the first time we've actually compared pre vs in-season in a professional rugby population. We found unclear differences between resting metabolic rate in season, although it looked to be lower. Only one participant was higher. And we found a clear difference in total energy expenditure in season, about 300 calories lower. So that dispels that myth that rugby players can't put on size in season, especially your young athletes. You need to be using the full season to build muscle mass, to put on size. Pre-season energy expenditures are really, really high. They were spending 4,500 calories a day on average in pre-season. We had one guy spending 6,000 calories a day. He's only 17. How is he going to put on muscle mass? So yeah, consequently, they need to eat a lot. Really interesting and stuff as well is that they didn't account for the energetic cost of these collisions. They didn't eat more. That was shown across all the macronutrients. So are they actually in homeostasis? Are they accounting for this energetic damage? We showed across the preseason that players actually lost weight. And it ultimately comes down to behavior change. We now have the information, you know they have large energy expenditures, you know you need to eat a lot, so what are you going to do to desire that change? How are you going to make sure your athlete's eating enough to be fueled optimally for training, to fuel development? It really comes down to changing their behavior. Are they capable of eating enough? Do they have the opportunity to eat? Are they motivated? You really need to hit all those three if you want to change the behavior. Just out of time. It's a balancing act. What can you do to change the environment to support that? And this comes from the influencer model of behavior change, which I think is fantastic. One, be clear about the results you want to achieve and how you're going to measure them. Are you measuring energy balance in your athletes? How do you know they're eating enough? Are they fueled? Are they underfueled? Focus on a small number of vital behaviors and really over-determine change. I want to finish with this final point. Behavior change, whether you're trying to do a home-based gym program, as Jono was explaining earlier, or you're trying to get your athlete to eat more, we always try and overdrive success. And if you think of behavior on an equilibrium, you have restraining actions which stop you from doing something and drivers which make you do something. Try and remove the restrictions, change their environment. If they're not eating enough, provide food. Make shakes. It doesn't have to be anything fantastic, it could just be milk. If they're not doing a home-based gym program, I'm sure there was something that you could look at for that as well. Summary, because I'm definitely gone over, apologies. Rugby players have distinct energy expenditures across any sport, I would say, so they need to eat a lot. We likely caused by collisions. They don't account for this within their diet, so you need to give them support. Practitioners and coaches are required to drive this support. Make sure you do everything you can to support them eat enough. Thank you for listening.